Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 13th, and we're looking back 69 years to November 13th, 1956. On that day, the United States Supreme Court issued a brief, unanimous decision affirming a lower court ruling that Alabama's state and local laws requiring segregation on buses were unconstitutional. The decision was just one sentence in a case called Browder versus Gale, but that single sentence validated a year-long struggle in Montgomery, Alabama, where black citizens had been boycotting city buses to protest segregation and discrimination. The Supreme Court's ruling meant that Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and the thousands of Black Montgomery residents who had walked to work, organized carpools, and sacrificed for 381 days had won. Jim Crow segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional, and the nonviolent protest movement that began with one woman refusing to give up her bus seat had achieved a landmark legal victory that would inspire the broader civil rights movement for the next 2 decades. The story of how that Supreme Court decision came to be and what it meant is about courage, strategy, sacrifice, and the power of collective action to change laws that seemed permanent. To understand the significance of the Supreme Court's decision, we need to understand just how deeply segregation was embedded in Southern life in the 1950s. The Jim Crow system that had developed after Reconstruction wasn't just social custom, it was law. State and local statutes mandated racial separation in virtually every aspect of public life. In Montgomery, Alabama, as in cities throughout the South, segregation on public buses was strictly enforced. Black passengers paid their fare at the front of the bus, then had to exit and re-enter through the rear door. They were required to sit in the back section. The front seats were reserved for white passengers. The middle section was a contested zone where black passengers could sit, but only if no white passengers needed those seats. If the white section filled up, black passengers in the middle section had to stand and give their seats to white passengers. This system was enforced not just by law, but by humiliation. Bus drivers had police authority and could and did arrest black passengers who refused to comply. Black passengers paid the same fare as white passengers, but received profoundly unequal treatment. Drivers routinely insulted black passengers, called them racial slurs, and sometimes drove off after black passengers had paid at the front door, but before they could re-enter at the back. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dehumanizing. Every day, black citizens in Montgomery and throughout the South were reminded that they were considered second-class citizens, unworthy of basic dignity and respect. And this wasn't the distant past. This was 1955, just over a decade after World War II, when black Americans had fought for democracy abroad while being denied full democracy at home. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress and longtime NAACP member, boarded a Montgomery bus after work. She sat in the middle section. When the white section filled up, the bus driver ordered Parks and 3 other black passengers to give up their seats. The others complied. Parks refused. Parks wasn't just tired from work. as the oversimplified version of the story sometimes suggests. She was tired of the humiliation, tired of the injustice, and tired of a system that treated her as less than human. She had been thinking about resistance for years. She had attended workshops on nonviolent resistance at the Highlander Folk School. When the moment came, she made a conscious decision to say no. The bus driver called police. Parks was arrested, fingerprinted, and jailed. That night, local black leaders, including E.D. Nixon of the NAACP and Joanne Robinson of the Women's Political Council, recognized an opportunity. Previous arrests of black women for similar offenses hadn't sparked sustained action, but Rosa Parks was known and respected in the community. She was dignified, articulate, and had an impeccable reputation. Her case could be the catalyst they needed. Working through the night, Robinson and others printed and distributed 35,000 leaflets, calling for a one-day bus boycott on Monday, December 5th, the day of Parks' trial. They asked Montgomery's black community to stay off the buses to protest segregation and Parks' arrest. The one-day boycott was astonishingly successful. On December 5th, 1955, Montgomery's buses ran nearly empty. Black citizens who normally relied on buses walked to work, carpooled, took taxis, or rode mules and horses. At a mass meeting that evening at Holt Street Baptist Church, thousands of Black Montgomery residents gathered to decide whether to continue the boycott. A young Baptist minister who had recently moved to Montgomery was chosen to address the crowd. His name was Martin Luther King, Jr. He was just 26 years old and had been in Montgomery only a year. But when King spoke that night, he articulated a vision that would define the civil rights movement: nonviolent resistance based on moral principle, sacrifice for justice, and determination to claim the full rights of citizenship. The crowd voted to continue the boycott until three demands were met: courteous treatment by bus drivers, first-come, first-served seating, with whites filling from the front and blacks from the back, but no requirement to give up seats, and hiring of black bus drivers for predominantly black routes. These were modest demands, not even full integration, just basic fairness. Montgomery officials refused. The boycott continued and continued. For weeks, then months, Black Montgomery residents organized one of history's most effective nonviolent protests. The Montgomery Improvement Association, led by King, coordinated an elaborate carpool system with volunteer drivers and strategically positioned pickup points. Black-owned taxi companies charged reduced fares. Churches bought station wagons to transport people. Many simply walked, sometimes for miles each day. White authorities tried everything to break the boycott. They arrested carpool drivers for minor traffic violations. They indicted boycott leaders under an old anti-boycott law. King himself was arrested, his home was bombed, and he received constant death threats. Insurance companies canceled policies on church-owned vehicles used in carpools. Police harassed drivers and passengers, but the boycott held. While the boycott captured public attention, civil rights lawyers pursued a parallel legal strategy. Rather than challenging Parks's conviction directly, which would have meant arguing within the segregation system, they filed a federal lawsuit attacking the constitutionality of segregation itself. The case was Browder versus Gale, named for plaintiff Aurelia Browder and defendant W.A. Gale, the mayor of Montgomery. The plaintiffs were several black women who, like Parks, had been mistreated on Montgomery buses. Their lawyers argued that bus segregation laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This was a bold strategy. The legal precedent wasn't encouraging. In 1896, the Supreme Court's infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision had upheld separate but equal facilities, specifically in the context of railroad cars. That precedent had stood for 60 years, providing legal justification for segregation across the South. But the legal landscape was changing. In 1954, the Supreme Court had ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that school segregation was unconstitutional, explicitly rejecting the separate but equal doctrine in education. Civil rights lawyers argued that the logic of Brown applied equally to public transportation. Segregation was inherently unequal, regardless of whether it involved schools or buses. On June 5, 1956, a three-judge federal panel ruled 2-1 that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. Montgomery officials immediately appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The boycott continued while everyone waited for the Supreme Court's decision. The Supreme Court announced its decision on November 13, 1956. In a brief, unsigned order, the court affirmed the lower court's ruling. Alabama's laws requiring segregated buses were unconstitutional. The decision cited Brown v. Board of Education, making clear that the principle applied to public transportation as well as education. The ruling was terse, just one sentence, but its impact was enormous. After 381 days, the Montgomery bus boycott had achieved its goal. Not the modest reforms initially demanded, but complete desegregation. The Supreme Court had declared that segregation on public transportation violated the Constitution. When news of the decision reached Montgomery, there was jubilation in the black community. At a mass meeting that night, King told the crowd, "We came to see that in the long run, it is more honorable to walk in dignity than ride in humiliation." The boycott had been exhausting, economically damaging, and dangerous, but it had worked. The formal court order arrived in Montgomery on December the 20th, 1956. The next morning, King, Nixon, Robinson, and other boycott leaders boarded a city bus and sat in the front seats. The Montgomery bus boycott was officially over. Bus segregation in Montgomery, and by extension throughout the South, was finished. The Supreme Court's decision and the successful boycott had implications far beyond Montgomery's buses. The victory demonstrated that nonviolent resistance could work. It showed that ordinary people, through collective action and sacrifice, could challenge and overturn unjust laws. And it introduced the nation to Martin Luther King Jr., whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance and whose eloquent articulation of justice would guide the civil rights movement for the next 12 years. The Montgomery model, nonviolent direct action combined with legal challenges, became the template for civil rights activism. The sit-ins at lunch counters, the freedom rides challenging segregation in interstate transportation, the Birmingham campaign, the March on Washington, all drew inspiration and tactical lessons from Montgomery. The decision also had immediate legal effects. Similar bus segregation laws throughout the South were now unconstitutional. Other cities began desegregating their public transportation, some voluntarily, others only after protests and legal challenges. The wall of Jim Crow was developing cracks. But resistance was fierce. Many white Southerners viewed the decision not as justice, but as federal tyranny imposed on states' rights. Massive resistance movements formed to oppose desegregation. Violence against civil rights activists intensified. The Ku Klux Klan bombed black churches and homes. In January 1957, just weeks after buses were integrated, 4 churches and 2 homes in Montgomery were bombed, including the homes of Ralph Abernathy, King's close associate. The struggle was far from over. The Supreme Court's decision ended legal segregation on buses, but it didn't end racism, discrimination, or white supremacist violence. Those battles would continue for years, requiring more protests, more sacrifices, and more legal victories before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided comprehensive legal protections. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded because of sustained collective action by thousands of ordinary people. Rosa Parks' individual act of defiance sparked the movement, and King's leadership inspired and guided it. But the boycott worked because thousands of Montgomery's black citizens, maids and gardeners and cooks and teachers and preachers, made daily sacrifices for an entire year. They walked to work in the heat and rain. They organized carpools and waited at pickup points. They contributed what money they could to support the movement. They attended mass meetings to maintain morale and commitment. They faced harassment, arrest, and violence. And they persisted day after day because they believed justice was worth the sacrifice. This collective action was carefully organized. The Montgomery Improvement Association ran the boycott with impressive efficiency, coordinating transportation, managing finances, maintaining communication, and sustaining morale over many months. This wasn't spontaneous anger, it was disciplined, strategic resistance. The boycott also demonstrated the economic power of black consumers. Montgomery's bus system was losing 30,000 to 40,000 fares per day, the vast majority from black passengers. By November 1956, the bus company was facing bankruptcy. Economic pressure, combined with legal action, forced change. This lesson about economic leverage would inform future civil rights tactics, from sit-ins at segregated lunch counters to boycotts of companies that discriminated. The Supreme Court's decision on November 13, 1956, and the Montgomery bus boycott that led to it offer enduring lessons about creating social change. First, they demonstrate that unjust laws aren't permanent. Systems that seem immovable can be challenged and changed through strategic action. Segregation was embedded in law, enforced by police power, and defended by political leaders. It seemed like an unchangeable fact of Southern life, but determined people, working collectively, changed it. Second, the boycott illustrates the importance of combining different tactics. Nonviolent direct action, the boycott, worked alongside legal challenges, Browder versus Gale, and media attention, national coverage of the boycott. Sustainable movements need multiple approaches, not just one. Third, Montgomery shows that social change requires sacrifice. Boycott participants suffered real hardships, financial strain, physical exhaustion, violence, and arrest. King's home was bombed. Many participants lost jobs or faced retaliation. Change came at a cost, willingly paid by people who believed justice was worth the price. Fourth, the Supreme Court's role reminds us that legal institutions matter in protecting rights. The court could have upheld segregation, citing Plessy versus Ferguson. Instead, it built on Brown versus Board and extended constitutional protections to public transportation. Courts can be barriers to change or catalysts for it, depending on how they interpret the Constitution and understand their role. The Montgomery experience also teaches us about leadership. King emerged as a national figure during the boycott, but he always emphasized collective action over individual heroism. He regularly credited the ordinary participants who made the boycott work. Rosa Parks is rightly honored, but she always pointed to the community effort that followed her arrest. Sustainable movements need both inspiring leaders and committed participants. Today, we can ride any bus and sit anywhere we choose, regardless of race. That freedom, which seems so basic now, exists because of the courage of Rosa Parks, the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., the determination of thousands of Montgomery residents, and the Supreme Court's decision on November 13, 1956. But the work of the civil rights movement isn't finished. While legal segregation is gone, the effects of centuries of discrimination persist. Racial disparities in wealth, education, healthcare, housing, and criminal justice reflect the long shadow of segregation and slavery. The struggle for genuine equality continues, using different tactics for different challenges, but drawing inspiration from earlier victories. The Montgomery Bus Boycott also reminds us that progress isn't automatic. The Supreme Court didn't spontaneously decide to ban bus segregation. That decision came because people organized, sacrificed, and persisted in demanding their rights. Rights that aren't actively defended and extended can be eroded or lost. Each generation must do its part to expand justice and protect the freedoms won by previous generations. When we board a bus or train today, without thinking about where we can sit, we're benefiting from the sacrifices of people who walked for a year so their children wouldn't have to accept humiliation. When we see peaceful protests seeking justice, we're witnessing tactics refined in Montgomery. When courts protect constitutional rights, they're building on precedents like Browder versus Gale. The Supreme Court's one-sentence decision on November 13, 1956, changed American law. But the real change came from ordinary people deciding they had endured injustice long enough and committing themselves to nonviolent resistance until justice prevailed. That combination, legal action and collective moral witness, transformed America. And the lessons from Montgomery remain relevant whenever people face injustice and must decide how to respond. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The Supreme Court's decision banning bus segregation reminds us that unjust laws can be changed through collective action, strategic persistence, and moral courage. Understanding how previous generations won rights and freedoms helps us protect those gains and continue the work of building a more just society. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Richard Backus, and I'll be back tomorrow with another story from our shared past.